Your neighbor leaves for work at 7:43 every morning. Same time, same route. You've noticed. You notice everything now, not because you're paranoid, but because noticing is your job. That's what they trained you for. 5 years of training for this, for a quiet house, in a quiet suburb, for a name that isn't yours, for a life that belongs to someone who doesn't exist. You are a sleeper agent, and right now, you're waiting. The question nobody thinks to ask about sleeper agents is not whether they exist. They do, provably, documentably, caught on camera in Grand Central Terminal and Central Park, and the coffee shops of Manhattan. The question is, what does it actually feel like to be one? To build a real life on a false foundation? To make genuine friends you're prepared to betray? To become so convincingly ordinary that the most powerful intelligence agency in the world looks right at you and sees nothing? That's what this video is about. And by the end, you'll understand why the most dangerous enemy in any country's history has almost always been the one standing right next to you in line at the grocery store. Let's start at the beginning, which, for a sleeper agent, is years before anyone suspects anything. You don't become a sleeper agent by accident. You're selected. Intelligence agencies, the Soviet KGB, its successor the Russian SVR, China's Ministry of State Security, Cuba's DGI, look for specific qualities when building deep cover operatives. They want people who are intelligent enough to maintain a complex cover story under pressure, but not so visibly exceptional that they attract attention. They want people with natural social instincts, the ability to build genuine relationships, to make people feel comfortable, to be liked without being memorable. They want composure, the ability to sit across from someone asking you uncomfortable questions and answer with the same body language, the same micro-expressions, the same vocal tone that an innocent person would use. Because the difference between a good liar and a great sleeper agent is that a great sleeper agent isn't lying. They're performing, and they've practiced the performance until it's become their natural state. The KGB called their deep cover operatives illegals. The term distinguished them from embassy-based intelligence officers who had diplomatic immunity if caught. Illegals had no immunity, no diplomatic protection, no official connection to their government that anyone could prove. If they were caught, Moscow could, and routinely did, deny they existed. They were entirely on their own. That's the arrangement. Total deniability for the agency. Total exposure for you. Your training begins with the language, not just vocabulary and grammar. Anyone can learn those. What takes years is the accent, the idioms, the way a particular city or region produces a particular rhythm of speech that native speakers absorb unconsciously over a lifetime, and that non-native speakers almost never fully replicate without prolonged immersion. The KGB sent their illegals to Canada for months of language immersion before deploying them into the United States, eating in diners, watching television, absorbing the texture of North American daily life until the performance became effortless. Then came the documents. The classic method, used by Soviet intelligence from the Cold War through the modern Russian SVR, involved dead children. Specifically, the birth records of children who had died young before the era of digital cross-referencing made it easy to link death certificates to birth records. Soviet agents would search graveyards and public records, find a child who had died at age 5 or 8 or 12, and build an entire identity on top of that foundation. A birth certificate becomes a social security number. A social security number becomes a driver's license. A driver's license becomes a bank account. A bank account becomes a credit history. A credit history becomes a real person, documented, verifiable, unremarkable, who can rent apartments, apply for jobs, and move through American society without triggering a single flag. Jack Barsky knows exactly how this works, because Jack Barsky is what the identity looks like from the inside. Barsky's real name is Albrecht Dittrich. He was an East German chemistry professor, intelligent, ideologically committed to communism, who was recruited by the KGB as a university student in the 1970s. The KGB spent 5 years training him and 9 other sleeper agents for deep cover operations. They found the gravestone of a boy who had died young in Maryland. They obtained his birth certificate. They built a complete false history around it. Fabricated school records, a fictional German-born mother to explain any lingering accent. By 1979, Albrecht Dittrich had ceased to exist. Jack Barsky had arrived in New York City with approximately $10,000 in cash and orders to infiltrate American society, identify potential Soviet recruits, and report back to Moscow via shortwave radio transmissions. For the next decade, he lived what he himself described as a 99% waiting life, 1% action. He got a job as a computer programmer. He built friendships. He moved through New York like a New Yorker. He was, by every observable measure, an ordinary American man building an ordinary American life. The intelligence he gathered was real, but not dramatic. Assessments of political climate, identification of potentially recruitable contacts, the texture of everyday American society that Moscow wanted to understand from the inside. He transmitted his reports in code. He received instructions by shortwave radio. He practiced dead drops. And then he went back to work on Monday morning and answered his coworkers' questions about his weekend with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years. Because he had. What Moscow didn't know, what Barsky himself was only beginning to understand, was that something unexpected was happening underneath the performance. He was becoming the character. He had a daughter, an American daughter, born in New York, 18 months old, and when the KGB sent a message in 1988 ordering him to return, their cover had potentially been compromised by a defector, and they needed him out. Barsky sat with that message and made a decision that had nothing to do with ideology or tradecraft or any of the calculations he'd been trained to make. He couldn't leave his daughter. He ignored the first message. The second one arrived with the specific language of a final warning. Return home, or else you are dead, or else. The KGB did not phrase ultimatums gently. Barsky's response was what he later called probably the most brilliant lie he'd ever told. He radioed back to his handler and said he had contracted HIV. This was the late 1980s. AIDS was poorly understood, treatment was almost non-existent, and the Soviet Union was terrified of the disease spreading through its population. The KGB believed him. They sent a message to his family in East Germany telling them he had died from AIDS. His mother didn't know he was alive until the day she died. And Barsky, released from his assignment, declared dead by his own government, settled into his American life, and tried to become a normal person. He almost managed it. For about 6 years, he lived quietly in Pennsylvania, raising his daughter, working in technology, doing nothing that would draw attention. Then the FBI found him. A KGB defector named Vasily Mitrokhin had handed over archives of Soviet intelligence operations to British authorities in 1992. Barsky's name was in the files. By the mid-1990s, the FBI had been watching him long enough to know exactly what they had. When they finally knocked on his door, Barsky said later that his first reaction was to ask them what had taken so long. He cooperated fully. He gave the FBI his encryption algorithm. He provided detailed accounts of KGB training methods and operational procedures. He was never imprisoned. He became a counterintelligence asset, then a U.S. citizen. In 2014, Albrecht Dittrich, Jack Barsky, received an American passport. The man who arrived to spy on America became, legally and genuinely, American. But Barsky's story is one man, and the program that produced him never stopped. On June 27, 2010, the FBI arrested 10 Russian intelligence operatives living across the United States, in suburban New Jersey, in Yonkers, New York, in Boston, in Arlington, Virginia, in Manhattan. The operation was called Ghost Stories, an inside name that tells you exactly how the FBI saw these people, as presences no one could quite pin down, existing at the edge of visibility, always there and never quite real. The 10 arrested operatives had been under FBI surveillance for more than a decade. The Bureau had watched them get married, buy homes, raise children, attend school plays and neighborhood barbecues. One couple, living under the names Richard and Cynthia Murphy in Montclair, New Jersey, had 2 daughters who had grown up entirely in America, who spoke American English, who had American friends and American schools, and no idea that their parents' names were not their parents' names. Another operative, Juan Lazaro, had built his identity on the birth certificate of a Uruguayan child who had died in 1947 at age 3. He'd been living inside that dead child's identity for more than 30 years. They communicated with Moscow through methods that sounded like fiction until the FBI produced the evidence in court. Messages hidden inside digital photographs, written in disappearing ink, transmitted through ad hoc wireless networks. They passed materials to each other by swapping identical bags in the stairwell of a train station. One of them, Anna Chapman, a red-haired, socially magnetic former real estate agent in Manhattan, used a laptop to create private wireless networks in coffee shops, transmitting encrypted messages to a Russian government official parked nearby. The FBI broke her encryption. Then they planted an informant who posed as a fellow Russian operative, and Chapman handed over information that confirmed everything the Bureau already knew. The FBI had prepared to wait even longer before making arrests. What forced their hand was a phone call. Chapman called her father in Moscow, her real father, in Russia, and the FBI was listening. The arrests happened within days. None of the 10 were convicted of espionage. According to the FBI's own assessment, they never obtained any classified documents. But a counterintelligence agent who worked the case said something that stays with you. Without us there to stop them, given enough time, they would have eventually become successful. The SVR was in it for the long haul. They'd been willing to wait decades. They'd built real families, real relationships, real social networks inside American policymaking circles. The infrastructure was there. The harvest just hadn't come yet. The 10 were deported to Russia on July 9, 2010, in a spy swap at a Vienna airport, the largest prisoner exchange since the Cold War. Russia received its operatives back. The U.S. received 4 prisoners, including a Russian double agent who would later be poisoned in England by the same government that had just welcomed his former colleagues home. The children of the arrested spies stayed in America. Some of them had no other country to go to. Here's what the story of sleeper agents actually reveals, stripped of the spy thriller framing. Intelligence agencies don't run illegals programs because they're cheap or quick. They're neither. They're expensive, slow, and they require an extraordinary investment in the psychological stability of the individual operative, because the thing they're counting on most is human adaptability. The fact that people can and do become the characters they perform, given enough time. That a man trained in East Germany to infiltrate American society can, a decade later, look at an 18-month-old girl and decide that she matters more than his mission. That 2 Russian operatives raising daughters in suburban New Jersey can build a life so real that even after the arrest, after the deportation, after the confession in federal court, those daughters grow up American because America is the only thing they've ever known. The program exploits human adaptability, and it's defeated by it too. Right now, there are people living in cities you've been to, in countries you'd recognize, under names that aren't theirs, with documents built on foundations that don't exist. Some of them are waiting to be activated. Some of them have gone native in ways their handlers don't yet know. Some of them are sitting across from someone they've come to genuinely care about, doing the math, measuring the distance between who they were trained to be and who they've become. And some of them, the ones the FBI doesn't catch, you'll never know about. That's the point. That's always been the point. The enemy in plain sight is only dangerous as long as you don't look directly at them. We started with your neighbor leaving at 7:43 every morning. Same time, same route. Ordinary enough that no one thinks to question it. The sleeper agent's whole life is built on the assumption that ordinary is invisible. And for years, sometimes decades, they're right. If you want to understand the other side of this story, how counterintelligence agencies actually identify and track sleeper operatives, and what the FBI's most sophisticated surveillance operations look like from the inside, that video is linked right here. Subscribe if this kind of content is why you're here. And drop a comment below. If you had to build a false identity from scratch in a foreign country tomorrow, what would be the one detail you think would give you away first?